I can definitely say that Sweden is known abroad in international negotiations for supporting subsidy reform, and exactly the things that Mikael has just covered are also on the agenda of the group of countries called Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, of which Sweden is a member together with other Nordic countries, New Zealand, Ethiopia, and Costa Rica. We would like now to scope a little bit further and look at a specific example of a regional development issue from Canada, since we are a Canadian-based institute. And I'd like to give the floor to my colleague, Pauline Gerrard, who is leading the Hudson Bay Inland Sea Initiative. And for those of you who are not familiar with Canada, I'd like to put a slide on the screen which shows the map of Canada, and particularly the Hudson Bay, which is a huge water body. And Pauline will guide you further.
Okay, thank you. Can you, yeah, that works. Good, thanks. So thank you very much for the invitation to be on this panel. It's a real honor. I feel somewhat humbled, as you can imagine. In answer to the broader panel session question, does government support to upstream oil and gas activities benefit Arctic communities? In fact, I'd like to argue that we're not really sure. On a case-by-case basis, we've heard over the last couple of days, there are successful examples in which companies are working directly with northern communities in real partnership. They're reaching agreements that give a proportion of revenues back to Inuit associations, for example, building long-term capacity and providing much-needed jobs in very remote areas. We heard a little bit this morning from Frank about the hopes that the Inuit region is bringing northern youth back to their area. So I think there are definitely opportunities here, and with thoughtful planning, it's possible that communities can and will and are benefiting. But as a policy researcher examining Arctic issues, one of the things that concerns me is the difficulty in calculating the true costs and benefits that are at stake and building these into the planning processes. ISD advocates that government policies and public spending should not undermine sustainable development. I think this is probably obvious and evident to everyone in the room. Cheap fossil fuels are a driver of climate change, and fossil fuel prices need to reflect the full social cost. The hard part, of course, is calculating these costs and ensuring that benefits, particularly to local communities, which is the topic of this session, outweigh the costs of the industry being there in the first place. As Yvette mentioned, I come to this debate from a regional perspective in Canada. That's not exactly the high Arctic, but the story and the issues are pretty similar. One of the hats that I wear at ISD is coordinator of the Hudson's Bay Inland Sea Initiative. The Hudson's Bay is the largest seasonally ice-covered inland sea in the world. For those of you that know the region, it can be defined as the Hudson Strait, Fox Basin, Hudson's Bay, James Bay, and Angava Bay. For those who are less familiar with the bays themselves, it's enough to say that it's a huge seascape that receives fresh water from a very large drainage basin extending from the Canadian Rockies all the way to Labrador, covering nearly 4 million square kilometers. It includes parts of the high Arctic in the north, it includes boreal forest in the south, and it's home directly around the bay to over 30 communities with large Inuit and Cree populations. At this stage, the Hudson's Bay Inland Sea Initiative is largely about a dialogue and bringing different jurisdictional planning processes together to understand the implications of developments at the regional level. Hudson's Bay is managed at a jurisdictional basis, and planning processes are happening within the jurisdiction, but there's very little dialogue between those. The initiative was in fact started because communities in the Belcher Islands, which are part of Nunavut, were being impacted or feeling impacts of hydro development that was happening in Quebec. And it was because of communities that spoke out that we realized that there needs to be discussion around the region about kind of at the ecosystem level about the implications that are being felt. The work, in addition to dialogue, has included a number of research studies, and we've been working with IVETA and the Global Subsidies Initiative to do some preliminary research on subsidies in the region. Maybe can you flip that next slide? This is part of some larger national studies that have been done that IVETA asked me to mention that we've done in Canada, Norway, and Russia. And I want to point out that we didn't pick these countries to point fingers in any way. It was mostly because we're trying to increase transparency and understanding of how subsidies work and the implications that they might have. Our research in the Hudson's Bay on subsidies is ongoing right now, but what we've found there, as well as internationally, is that there exists a complicated set of policies that governments implement at local, regional, national, and international levels. Yvette mentioned them a little bit earlier. They take the form of direct spending on transport and other infrastructure, budgetary support for resource exploration, research and development grants, monitoring systems, preferential loans, tax breaks, accelerated depreciation allowances, royalty relief, and other policies benefiting the extractive industries. I don't even really understand what all that means. And so it's clear to me that we need to make things more transparent and easier to understand for everybody, so that we can clearly see what projects are, what they cost, and understand what public goods they're bringing in directly to communities themselves, as well as to national taxpayers and the global community. What we also know and have learned from this work is that there are considerable negative environmental externalities associated with the extractive industry sector, such as implications on climate change or the loss of or alteration of ecosystem goods and services. And I think we need to understand these better and incorporate them into planning as well. Finally, we heard a lot about this morning, but I think it's obviously very important and worth reiterating, is that communities themselves need to be involved in all of the levels of this work. They need to bring their understanding of the local environments and culture to the table to be able to clearly understand and calculate full costs and benefits and negotiate for themselves directly with industry and governments as part of jurisdictional planning. They also need to understand lessons learned from a circumpolar perspective and to be able to work together as part of the broader regional, national, international planning processes that are ongoing. We've obviously made huge headway in terms of both community engagement, legal frameworks, policy mechanisms to make sure that this is happening, and I think we are definitely moving forward. But as you may have heard from Mary this morning, if you were in the plenary session in our region, I think it's fair to say that we have an educational problem. The education system really wasn't designed with the local culture in mind, and I worry that if we don't work on this directly, then we're not building the foundations that are needed to move forward. There's a huge, rapidly growing young population in the north, and when Mary said the figure this morning of 25% aren't graduating from high school, it gives me a physical pain in my stomach, and the same thing that I feel when I think about my own children. So I think that when I get my $1,000 or $1 million, you'll see that that'll be part of my focus, but it's one of the core areas that I think we need to build capacity, to use a catchphrase, to start to address these broader issues that I talked about. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Pauline. So you definitely deserve your $1 million Arctic dollars.